Hi, Marcelo.
Hi, Tanya. How are you?
I'm. I feel like that's a loaded question these days, but but here we are. I'm grateful to be having this conversation with you.
Well,
So
thank you for your time. Yeah.
yeah, no, thank you so much for your time and thank you for your amazing work. I thought we would start by just having you introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Dr. Marcelo Freier, and I'm a scientist that's focused on the immune system. I'm very much passionate to understand and decode the immune response. We're also trying to find ways to make your immune system really work towards a better healing potential.
And now, so in this conversation, we want to look at a microscopic level at what's going on inside our bodies, especially in the context of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So first, I want to ask you, how do our cells communicate with each other?
Mhm. So our cells are in constant communication in our body. So there are direct ways that cells are communicating, and there are also soluble ways and more indirect ways. So think of cells as like an octopus in the ocean that have all those ways to interact with their environment and other species. So cells pretty much do what an octopus does, where cells can have a direct touch to their environment, but can also have a direct interaction with other cells. So, for example, there are immune cells that give information to T cells. There are immune cells that are in contact with bone or skin. So cells are constantly communicating. And the soluble way and more indirect way is that where cells release materials from inside. So, for example, they can release DNA, they can release RNA, lipids, or even proteins as ways to talk. And some of these signals are very programmed and very direct. So, if cells really kind of raise their voices and release these molecules called cytokines, then the environment will learn that this is like an inflammatory response. But then if the cells really release something different, like get out of here, then they will learn that this is like an anti-inflammatory response. So there's constant signals within cell and cell communication. That's key for biological and human health.
And so, what happens to cells when they're confronted with infection?
So think about cells like we produce around like 100 billion cells, 100 billion immune cells a day. So we produce this army to fight a lot of things. And when you say infection, I just want to clarify, microbes are in our body, surrounded our body, within our body. And what's really cool is that we can live in symbiosis, which is this equilibrium with bacteria and yeast or fungi. But then there are microbes that sometimes act up, and they are a little bit like pathogens. They're considered like the bad guys. So then we call them an infectious agent. And they cause an infectious because not only they enter your body, but they're able to establish themselves somewhere in their body. They're able to go through your blood vessels. They're able to install in the lungs. So now with the COVID pandemics, we really can appreciate the pathogen, right? So the SARS-CoV-2 viruses comes in through the airways and then goes to the lung and really creates an infectious site. And now once the virus is there, then the army of immune cells migrate. So imagine all those soldiers bringing all types of equipment, coming to the front line, and they are some ways coming in high amounts and migrating because amount and the amount matters, but in other ways, the immune response is really specific. Meaning you might create antibodies and might create immune response that's so specific for the viruses that might kill the viruses. So the major immune response towards an infectious agent is through inflammatory response, where you have heat, pain, and you have fever, and you have redness. So those four cardinal signs of inflammation can be very beneficial and cyclic and can be really helpful for you to fight the infection.
And then, do cells die? Like what's happening?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I love talking about that because I spoke about how cells are constantly migrating and being generated in the bone marrow, and then they migrate to the adult tissues like skin and blood vessels. But then the cells are also releasing their content to fight. So say 100 cells come in and they release their DNA, and now they release their proteins, they're communicating. There's something wrong here. And they do that in a very synchronized way, and they actually die for that function. But some of them acquire that information, migrate to lymph nodes, migrate to specialized networks, and then they start to feed forward that signal. And that signal not only creates immunity, but that signal that cells are dying creates a signal to our bone marrows, to create a signal to our adult tissues to produce more cells. So yeah, cells die, and cells die with a purpose. Sometimes pathogens trigger cells to die, but sometimes your body has a programmed way of cells to die. So yeah, cells are constantly dying.
And are they able to regenerate or be reborn or?
Correct. Yeah, they are. So imagine these cells that I just spoke about that they are dying and they're sending effector signals, effector functions. They now are able to migrate back other cells and create that signal for other cells to regenerate. So in a day, we produce around 100 billion of immune cells. And in fact, if you think about the context of our body, we produce trillions of cells every day. And if you think like in a year time frame, we may actually produce our entire mass again and again. So we're constantly regenerating again. And that's very important for the immune system because each person is a unique being. Even though we are all connected to the same building blocks, we are all very unique. So you may traveled somewhere last week, you may, have gone another place. So our body is so unique, but we all receive that message that we need to regenerate and come back again.
So thinking about what's going on right now, there's so much talk about how the world has been forced to stop and we are in a moment of transition that we're being forced to kind of reboot, reassess where we're going. Do you
Yeah,
feel that there are parallels between what's going on inside our bodies and what's happening in the world?
absolutely. I think the COVID is really bringing to the surface that there are some populations more vulnerable than others. We see like how age is a factor here. You see young people reacting very differently than elders. You see weight, you see socioeconomic status, you see conditions that people are more vulnerable. But I think also there are lessons to be learned here. I think as humans, we need to think of the collective, is our community growing their immune responses? Do we have a herd immunity? How's vaccine accelerating this process? Questions that remains, if we are thinking of, can vaccine really overcome the fact that the virus can produce mutations? How are we gonna, massively immunize the entire population? So yeah, I think this immune talk that we're having here really applies to what's going on outside, vulnerability, stress, fatigue. This all affects the immune system.
Now, what role I've seen some of the illustrations that you've shared about cells and the
Yeah,
concept of cell death and regeneration. Now, how
yeah.
does art play into your work as a scientist?
Well, I love to talk about art and science because I think they go hand in hand. And every time I'm thinking about immune cells, I'm constantly doing analogy. I'm thinking of like neutrophils, which are cells coming in, which are like Pac-Man eating. But also growing up in Brazil, bless you, growing
Love
up in
to redo that.
Brazil, uh, growing up in Brazil, I was a very
Can we go
curious.
back to the beginning of
Okay.
that and do it
Okay.
again? So I'm going to
Yeah.
ask you the question again.
Okay.
So I've seen the beautiful, mesmerizing illustrations that you have shared of cells and how they die and are reborn. And I'm curious, what role does art play in your work as a scientist?
Well, let's think about imagination, exploration, and creativity. I love the fact that arts and science go hand in hand with those aspects. You know, a scientist, just like an artist, they are constantly um, thinking and imagining and having a creativity. That's how the spark of science really starts. Um, the idea that artists will spend time researching and finding the reference points, and they will spend hours and nights doing their research, and scientists will do the same. And growing up in Brazil, I've always been driven by curiosity. That has been something I'm constantly asking questions. And sometimes people didn't understand. Are you asking me? Are you not trusting me? But it came from a personality that I'm just very curious about everything. And I want to ask and I want to understand, how does that work? How do you put that together? What is going on? Do you have bacteria in that plant? Can I see it? Can I look anything else? What is DNA? And that curiosity really drove my career as a scientist. I started as a oral surgeon, a clinician, and really became very interested in bigger and scientific questions. And I think, for example, when my students today as a professor and having my lab with my students, I think it's super cool to see their way that they take the photo of the microscope, how they label the molecules, and the DNA, what colors are they going to contrast, what are the angles. So I can see the artistic side of my lab and the imagery, and also how we put the data together. How can we tell a story of that data? We have a lot of bioinformaticians putting network analysis. How can we make more sense? Or, what type of graphs can create a reaction, in movies? So I think art and science are very similar. I think one distinction, though, is thinking about that scientists are driven by data, and we are kind of detectives of the truth. So one of the major differences of scientists and a lot of other careers is that scientists are really, not only they're finding the data, but they need to confirm that that data is really reliable. And I think that's how we make a global impact.
Do you have anything else you want to share with the audience?
Well, I just want to say that science is the building block of being a rock star. Well, I just want to say thank you to you for your time, and thank you everyone for watching. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.